Subtle disrespect in workplaces often begins in ways so small that many people miss them altogether, yet for the person experiencing them, they land with a sharpness that cannot be ignored. It might be the tone someone uses, a dismissive glance, a sarcastic remark disguised as a joke, or the way certain people are constantly second-guessed even after they've proved their competence repeatedly. These moments accumulate slowly, and each one chips away at the sense of belonging that every employee deserves. In environments where hierarchy and power dynamics are already sensitive, even small gestures can reveal deeper biases that others pretend don't exist. But for the person on the receiving end, every gesture carries a message about how they're seen, how they're valued, and ultimately where some people think they belong. Often, workplaces claim to support equality, diversity, and respect, yet the behavior of individuals betrays the company's stated values. It's in the assumptions people make about role, skill level, or intelligence. It's in who gets interrupted, who gets ignored, who gets micromanaged, and who gets trusted. These patterns are not random, they grow from internalized biases that some people don't even realize they hold. When someone is a black professional, especially an executive, the stereotypes and preconceived notions can be even more pronounced. People may assume authority is undeserved, competence must be tested, or leadership must be questioned, as though success achieved by a black individual is somehow suspicious or requires extra verification. These subtle behaviors become the foundation of larger, more visible disrespect. In the case of this executive, disrespect did not arrive in the form of open hostility. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine procedure or harmless banter. But the underlying intent was clear: to undermine him publicly, to make him appear less competent, and to send a message to others about where those responsible believed he should stand. When staff members chose to target him, they weren't just acting on personal impulse. They were acting on long-held biases shaped by societal narratives that still influence how people perceive professionalism and authority. Their attempt to embarrass him wasn't an isolated incident, it was the result of attitudes that had been allowed to grow unchecked. Subtle disrespect is dangerous because it creates an environment where larger acts of humiliation become easier to justify. Once small slights go unchallenged, people start feeling comfortable pushing boundaries further. They test reactions. They observe whether their target will stay silent. If the person being disrespected remains calm, many interpret that silence incorrectly, as weakness, as acceptance, or as permission to escalate. This misunderstanding emboldens the disrespectful, making them think they can get away with more severe actions. So when the staff decided to publicly embarrass the executive, they were acting with a confidence that came from seeing smaller acts of disrespect ignored by others in the past. Bias in the workplace isn't always expressed through harsh words or explosive confrontations. More often, it lives in everyday choices: whose ideas are taken seriously, who is excluded from informal discussions, who is spoken over in meetings, and who is given credit for work. Bias affects evaluation, promotion, and even the tone of communication. It can influence who gets the benefit of the doubt and who is held to stricter standards. In many cases, the people who perpetuate these behaviors don't consider themselves biased, they think they're being objective or following routine. But intent does not erase impact. And the executive in this situation understood that deeply. What makes subtle disrespect especially harmful is that it forces the target into a dilemma. If they speak up, they risk being labeled sensitive, defensive, or confrontational. If they stay silent, the disrespect continues and sometimes escalates. Navigating this tension requires immense emotional intelligence. The executive likely recognized that responding impulsively would have given his critics exactly what they wanted. He knew that the real challenge was not just addressing the incident, but exposing the underlying mindset driving it. His restraint was not weakness, it was strategy, patience, and awareness. Workplaces often prefer polished statements about inclusion rather than confronting the uncomfortable truths that undermine those statements. It's easier to put diversity policies on paper than to challenge the subtle behaviors that contradict them. The executive's experience highlights how real change often begins not with grand announcements but with individuals calling out what others refuse to see. Subtle disrespect forces conversations people try to avoid because it reveals the gap between the company's values and the daily reality lived by marginalized employees. This keynote shows how small acts of disrespect are never really small. They are signals, warnings, and sometimes open doors to larger injustices. The staff's attempt to embarrass the executive publicly was simply the climax of a pattern that had been building quietly, fueled by biases that had gone unaddressed for too long. The executive's calm response did not come from passivity or fear but from a profound understanding of leadership and human behavior. When someone is targeted publicly, the natural instinct is often to react with equal force, to defend oneself instantly, or to confront the disrespect head-on. But the executive chose a different path, one rooted in control, clarity, and an awareness that power is not always expressed through volume or aggression. His silence, his composed posture, and his measured expression were not signs of weakness, they were signs of a man who understood that the greatest impact often comes from responding, not reacting. By maintaining calm, he shifted the emotional balance of the room without uttering a word, making everyone present question the behavior of those who attempted to demean him. In that moment, the staff expected him to crumble, to lash out, or at least show visible discomfort. They wanted to validate their own biases by provoking him. They believed that if they triggered an emotional reaction, they could justify their disrespect afterward, framing it as a misunderstanding or a response to his attitude. But when he remained composed, their plan crumbled. Their confidence wavered. Instead of appearing as bold challengers of authority, they suddenly looked unprofessional, petty, and insecure. His calmness served as a mirror, forcing them to confront their own behavior and exposing how inappropriate and calculated their actions truly were. The entire room felt the shift. People who were silent observers, those who had been unsure how to feel, suddenly sensed the imbalance of dignity. They saw a man standing firmly in his self-respect despite being pushed. They saw control where others hoped to cause chaos. They saw poise where others expected defensiveness. This shift didn't require a speech or an argument, it required presence. A presence built on self-confidence, on years of experience dealing with subtle and overt challenges, and on the wisdom of knowing that power expressed quietly can be more transformative than power expressed loudly. Calmness, in moments of conflict, has the ability to disarm people. It slows down the momentum of disrespect. It forces onlookers to read the energy of the person being targeted rather than the noise of the aggressor. The executive understood that the staff's attempt to embarrass him relied on public reaction. They wanted to control the narrative by making him appear inferior or incompetent. But his composed demeanor wrested that control away from them. It allowed him to become the center of integrity in the room, while those who attempted to shame him became the center of scrutiny. Calmness, in this case, did not act as passive acceptance, it served as a strategic pause that allowed him to reclaim authority without confrontation. His response also revealed the depth of his emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence isn't just about managing feelings, it's about understanding the psychological landscape of a situation. The executive recognized that anger would fuel the power dynamic his offenders wanted to create. He understood that if he matched their disrespect with aggression, he would give them exactly the justification they needed to continue undermining him. Instead, he demonstrated emotional mastery, showing that he would not allow anyone else's behavior to dictate his own. This level of composure is rare, especially under public pressure, but it is one of the hallmarks of strong leadership. The staff who initiated the disrespect had expected to be in control of the storyline. They believed they held the advantage because the situation was staged publicly, in front of colleagues. They assumed that their coordinated attempt to diminish him would leave him vulnerable. What they underestimated was how powerfully controlled energy can disrupt even the most calculated humiliation. Calmness created unpredictability. It left them puzzled, unsure of how to continue, and their plans slowly unraveled. As they realized that their attempt wasn't yielding the reaction they hoped for, their confidence began to erode. Their expressions changed. Their voices faltered. They became visibly uncomfortable, exposing their own insecurity. In contrast, the executive's controlled response strengthened the trust and respect others had for him. People in the room, especially those who had doubts about the situation, started to see the stark contrast between character and conduct. His approach reaffirmed his authority not through title, but through behavior. Leadership is often revealed most clearly not when everything goes smoothly, but when someone is confronted unfairly. His calmness showed that he was not defined by the actions of others, he was defined by his ability to rise above them. This single moment became a turning point because it upended expectations. It showed that composure can be more powerful than confrontation. It exposed the insecurity behind the attempted humiliation. It shifted sympathy, respect, and alignment toward the executive without him needing to argue or defend himself. The energy in the room transformed because calmness forced everyone to see the truth of what was happening rather than the narrative the staff tried to create. Emotional intelligence is one of the most underestimated strengths in professional environments, especially in moments where tension rises and disrespect becomes public. Many people equate power with loudness, authority with dominance, and leadership with the ability to overpower others. But emotional intelligence rewrites those assumptions entirely. It reveals that knowing how to manage one's internal world creates more influence than trying to control the external environment. In this situation, the executive demonstrated not just knowledge, but mastery, an ability to stay grounded when others were attempting to destabilize him. His response was not accidental, it came from a deep understanding of his own emotions, as well as an awareness of the emotional patterns of those around him. Emotional intelligence begins with self-awareness. People who lack self-awareness often react impulsively, especially under stress. But the executive showed that he understood the importance of pausing, observing, and processing before engaging. He didn't let the hostility directed at him dictate his behavior. He refused to meet disrespect with more disrespect. This level of internal control is powerful because it keeps a person centered, even when the environment becomes chaotic or unfair. By staying connected to his values, his confidence, and his sense of self, he remained steady while those who targeted him became visibly unsettled. Another aspect of emotional intelligence is the capacity to read others. The executive was not just aware of his own emotions, he was keenly aware of what the staff was trying to provoke. He could sense the nervous excitement behind their attempt to embarrass him, the shared glances as they anticipated a reaction, the expectation that he would feel belittled. This awareness allowed him to step back mentally and examine the situation with clarity. Instead of reacting to the disrespect at face value, he looked deeper at the motivations and insecurities behind it. Emotional intelligence transforms moments like this because it prevents a person from becoming entangled in someone else's emotional chaos. The executive understood that confronting the situation aggressively would give the offenders exactly what they wanted. They were looking for validation, proof that their disrespect could destabilize him. But he denied them that satisfaction. Emotional intelligence teaches that sometimes the most effective response is one that deprives the aggressor of the emotional reaction they seek. By doing so, he regained control without needing to raise his voice or assert dominance. His calm became a barrier they could not penetrate, a shield that their attempts could not break. What made his reaction even more impactful was his ability to manage the atmosphere of the room. Emotional intelligence extends beyond personal composure, it influences the emotional energy of everyone present. When he stayed steady, others around him began to reassess the situation. Observers who might not have been sure how to interpret the moment suddenly saw the staff's disrespect more clearly. They noticed the imbalance between his quiet dignity and the petty behavior aimed at him. His restraint created a space where truth became visible, and people could no longer pretend the incident was harmless or justified. Emotional intelligence also involves choosing one's timing wisely. The executive understood that not every moment requires immediate correction. Sometimes the best thing to do is to observe, let others reveal their own character, and wait for the right moment to act. By not reacting instantly, he gave the situation room to expose itself. The staff who initiated the embarrassment began to look increasingly unprofessional as their behavior played out in real time. Their attempt to control the narrative slipped through their fingers because he refused to engage on their terms. He also applied empathy, not sympathy for the disrespectful behavior, but empathy in the sense of understanding the emotions driving it. He understood that disrespect often comes from insecurity, jealousy, fear of being overshadowed, or resistance to seeing someone they underestimated succeed. This insight allowed him to detach himself from the attempted humiliation. He did not internalize their behavior, he recognized it as a reflection of their own limitations, not his value or capability. Emotional intelligence helps people understand that the actions of others are rarely about them, they are about what the other person carries within. Finally, emotional intelligence empowered him to choose a response that elevated him instead of lowering him to the level of those who tried to undermine him. He recognized that real strength lies in maintaining self-respect while also modeling the behavior expected of a leader. Rather than reacting emotionally, he responded intentionally. Rather than defending himself, he allowed his composure to speak for him. His confidence did not need validation from others. His sense of identity did not waver because someone attempted to challenge it. Emotional intelligence allowed him to take control of the moment not through force, but through presence, clarity, and mastery over his own emotional landscape. Leadership is often romanticized as a position of authority, a title, or the ability to direct others, but true leadership is tested most honestly in moments of adversity, especially when dignity is attacked. When someone in a position of responsibility is disrespected publicly, the reaction they choose becomes a defining measure of who they are, not just as a professional but as a human being. In the case of this executive, the attack on his dignity was a deliberate attempt to diminish him, yet his response revealed a level of leadership that went far beyond job descriptions or formal roles. Instead of allowing the disrespect to derail his composure, he used the moment to demonstrate what real authority looks like when it is grounded in character rather than ego. To understand the depth of his leadership, it's important to recognize that dignity is not just about pride, it is about the inherent worth every person carries. When someone tries to strip that away, the instinctual reaction is anger or defensiveness. Many leaders, when under pressure, allow frustration to spill over, sometimes forgetting that their reaction becomes part of the narrative. But this executive understood that leadership is not about reacting to disrespect, it is about rising above it in a way that reaffirms strength without compromising principle. His ability to hold steady while being confronted unfairly showed that leadership is as much about internal fortitude as it is about external responsibilities. Leadership also shines in the way it influences others. In the room, people were watching closely. Some were neutral, unsure of how to interpret the situation. Others may have been waiting to see whether the executive would fall into the trap that had been set for him. His calm, dignified presence did more than protect his own self-respect, it shifted how everyone else perceived him. He didn't need to defend his title because his behavior demonstrated the maturity, control, and grace expected of someone in true authority. He became an example in that moment, not through force, but through the unmistakable clarity of his conduct. One of the most significant aspects of leadership when dignity is attacked is restraint. Restraint is not silence rooted in fear, it is silence rooted in strength. It takes tremendous discipline to hold back anger, especially when someone is trying to provoke an emotional reaction. The executive's restraint wasn't about ignoring what happened, it was about choosing a response that aligned with his values and his role. Rather than confronting the disrespect in the heat of the moment, he allowed his composure to become the response. This type of restraint is a hallmark of experienced leaders who understand that actions taken in anger can undermine long-term respect, while measured responses build it. Leadership also involves perspective, the ability to see beyond the immediate insult and recognize the bigger picture. The executive understood that this moment was not just about him, it was about the culture of the workplace, the behavior being modeled, and the standard being set for everyone else. If he retaliated or responded emotionally, it could reinforce the toxic dynamic that had already taken root. Instead, he took the broader view, one that allowed him to protect not only his dignity but also the integrity of his leadership. By showing that he could absorb disrespect without losing control, he communicated a message of stability, emotional intelligence, and maturity that resonated deeply with those who witnessed the incident. Another layer of leadership revealed during attacks on dignity is accountability, not in the sense of blaming others, but in the sense of holding oneself to a higher standard. Leaders cannot always control what is done to them, but they can control how they respond. The executive chose to be accountable to his own principles rather than to the emotions of the moment. He refused to let someone else's bad behavior dictate his character. This kind of accountability is rare, but it is one of the most powerful forms of influence because it demonstrates consistency. People trust leaders who remain the same regardless of circumstance. His response also showed a deep understanding of influence. Influence does not come from showing superiority, it comes from earning respect. And respect is earned most profoundly when dignity is challenged. The executive showed that respect cannot be taken away by disrespectful people, it can only be surrendered. He refused to surrender it. By maintaining his dignity, he preserved the respect of those who looked to him for guidance, and in many cases, he gained even more admiration from people who realized how difficult the moment truly was. Leadership in moments of attack is also about clarity, clarity of identity, clarity of purpose, and clarity of values. Anyone can lead when things are easy, but leading when dignity is targeted reveals who truly understands the weight of their role. The executive demonstrated that leadership is rooted not in authority granted by others, but in integrity maintained within oneself. His reaction showed that he knew who he was, and no amount of disrespect could alter his sense of self. This clarity allowed him to stand firm, respond wisely, and maintain the moral high ground, transforming an attempt to diminish him into a moment that highlighted his strength. The moment the staff realized who truly held the power did not arrive through a dramatic announcement, a raised voice, or an aggressive confrontation. It arrived quietly, almost silently, in the space between the executive's dignity and their own unraveling confidence. When they launched their attempt to embarrass him, they believed they had the advantage. They assumed that by controlling the setting and initiating the disrespect, they could shape the narrative. They believed that if they acted boldly enough, loudly enough, and publicly enough, they would dominate the moment. But what they miscalculated was the power of presence, how a person's inner strength, emotional discipline, and quiet authority can shift an entire room without a single word spoken. As the executive stayed composed, something subtle but undeniable began to change. The staff who initiated the incident started noticing that their words were losing impact. Instead of gaining support or validation from those watching, they began to sense a growing discomfort among the onlookers. Eyes that they expected would turn toward the executive with judgment were instead turning toward them with confusion, concern, and eventually disapproval. Their own confidence started to waver because they could feel the atmosphere shifting away from them. Power, the very thing they thought they were asserting, began slipping out of their hands. True power doesn't come from creating chaos, it comes from controlling one's response to it. And the executive's response, or rather, his controlled non-reaction, revealed a depth of authority that the staff had completely underestimated. They realized that someone who does not need to argue does not lack strength, they possess so much of it that they can afford to stay silent. Someone who does not allow disrespect to shake their composure is not powerless, they are rooted in a kind of confidence that does not depend on others' approval. The staff started to see that real power is not displayed, it is felt. It radiates quietly, steadily, unmistakably. The people in the room who had remained neutral began to shift their alignment. Their silent observations turned into a kind of collective judgment. They watched the staff push harder, but instead of the situation escalating in their favor, their behavior looked increasingly unprofessional. Every attempt to embarrass the executive now reflected more negatively on them. Every sarcastic comment or exaggerated gesture they used to try and provoke him became evidence of insecurity rather than authority. They realized too late that the room was watching, measuring, and silently deciding who carried themselves with integrity and who did not. When the executive finally spoke, or even if he spoke very little, the impact was multiplied by the calm foundation he had already established. His tone, controlled and steady, acted like a spotlight that illuminated the truth of the moment. Whatever he said carried weight not because of volume, but because of the moral and emotional ground he stood on. The staff felt the shift instantly. Their attempt to belittle him had only heightened his presence. Their attempt to expose his vulnerability had exposed their own. Their attempt to weaken his position had strengthened it in the eyes of everyone present. There comes a moment in situations like this when even the aggressors begin to understand that they have lost control. They start replaying their own actions in their mind. They feel the heat of embarrassment rising in themselves instead of in their target. Words that once felt bold now feel foolish. Their plan, which once seemed clever, suddenly feels reckless and petty. And in that realization, they learn a difficult truth: power built on disrespect is fragile, but power built on dignity is unshakable. The executive's presence also reminded them of something deeper: titles may define structure, but character defines influence. They may have held a temporary sense of control because they were the ones initiating the confrontation, but they quickly learned that control is meaningless when respect is not on your side. The room respected him, not just because of his position, but because of the way he upheld himself. Respect given by others is earned, but self-respect is commanded. When the staff saw that he would not bend, shrink, or react, they understood that he held an internal authority they could not challenge. And finally, the shift in power was confirmed not through confrontation, but through clarity. Clarity in the executive's demeanor. Clarity in the room's response. Clarity in the contrast between character and insecurity. The staff realized that in trying to take something from him, they had revealed who truly lacked control. They realized that the man they tried to embarrass was the one everyone looked to for stability. They realized that strength does not need to be loud to be undeniable. They realized that true power cannot be threatened by disrespect, it only becomes more visible in its presence. The transformation that followed the incident did not happen in a single moment, but the seed of it was planted the instant the executive chose dignity over reaction. When a leader handles disrespect with such control and clarity, it forces an entire environment to confront its own behavior. People who once remained silent begin to rethink their positions. Those who participated in or supported the disrespect start feeling the weight of their choices. Even those who were simply observing begin to recognize the deeper issues that had been hiding beneath everyday interactions. The executive's response initiated a shift, not just in how people viewed him, but in how they viewed themselves, their colleagues, and the culture they had created. This transformation began with awareness. Staff members who had previously turned a blind eye to subtle biases suddenly saw how destructive those behaviors could become when left unchecked. The attempted humiliation exposed the unhealthy dynamics that had been present for a long time. Many in the room realized that their silence had indirectly supported the behavior. They understood that neutrality in the face of disrespect is not neutrality at all, it is quiet endorsement. Seeing the executive maintain his dignity while others displayed unprofessional behavior forced many to re-evaluate their own values and responsibilities within the workplace. Awareness is often uncomfortable, but it is the first necessary step in any meaningful transformation. Next came accountability, and not the punitive kind. This accountability showed up in the reflective conversations people had with themselves after witnessing the incident. Some staff members questioned why they had allowed certain behavior to continue unchecked. Some wondered whether they had contributed to a culture where such an incident could occur. Others became more aware of their own biases, conscious of how easy it can be to underestimate someone based on assumption rather than truth. This internal accountability slowly began shifting the tone of the workplace. People became more cautious with their words, more thoughtful with their actions, and more aware of the power dynamics that could harm others. The executive's management of the situation also inspired respect that translated into behavioral change. It set a new standard of conduct, one that compelled people to treat others with greater consideration. Leaders who maintain dignity in the face of disrespect often influence others more deeply than leaders who respond with authority alone. This executive demonstrated what it means to lead from the inside out. His restraint, his control, and his unwavering composure created a model many wanted to emulate. The staff now had a living example of how real strength functions, and it motivated some to adjust their own approach to conflict, leadership, and communication. Transformation also unfolded in subtle shifts in workplace communication. People became more intentional about how they interacted with one another. Meetings changed tone. Conversations became more respectful. Individuals who once felt emboldened to test boundaries now hesitated before speaking, aware that their behavior carried consequences, not just professionally, but morally. The incident had exposed the cracks in the culture, and rather than being ignored, they began to be addressed. Even casual interactions took on a different energy because the room had collectively witnessed what integrity looked like under pressure. In addition, the transformation influenced workplace leadership structures. Individuals in higher positions began paying closer attention to how their employees were treated, not wanting to be associated with an environment where such disrespect could happen again. Some began re-examining policies, not because the executive demanded it, but because the situation revealed what had been overlooked. It became clear that leadership was not just about maintaining productivity, it was about nurturing an environment of respect, fairness, and emotional safety. The executive's example became a catalyst for conversations about values, culture, and expectations, prompting shifts that might not have occurred otherwise. There was also a transformation within the staff who initiated the disrespect. Although they may not have admitted it aloud, their confidence was shaken. They were confronted with the reality of their actions in a way they had not anticipated. Seeing the executive's composure forced them to confront their own behavior. Their attempt to embarrass someone publicly had failed, and instead of gaining influence, they had lost credibility. That realization often brings a kind of internal shift, one that leads people to reconsider their approach to power. It teaches them that respect cannot be demanded through intimidation, it must be earned through integrity. Finally, the incident created a long-lasting shift in how power was perceived within the workplace. Before, some individuals believed they could weaponize embarrassment, bias, or public humiliation to control others. But the executive's response shattered that illusion. The room saw firsthand that real power does not come from creating fear, it comes from embodying respect. It comes from knowing who you are, regardless of who tries to challenge you. This understanding slowly became part of the culture. People began seeing leadership not as a position, but as a way of showing up. They saw that dignity has its own influence, that composure commands attention, and that integrity has a strength that no attempt at humiliation can undermine.